And we're back. Greetings, everyone. This is Lucian Vâlsan, broadcasting from the middle of bloody nowhere, close to Galați, far east of Romania. As always, alongside with me is Herr Jon Gunnarsson, broadcasting from Deutschland, and our producer James Huff, making sure everything works just fine, broadcasting from the US. Now, sorry for the little bit of the delay. Not only we arrived very, very close to showtime, especially myself. I arrived 3 minutes before showtime, but also Google has decided to suck a little bit of an ass just when we were supposed to start. Anyway, greetings, Jon.
Good evening. How are your travels going?
They're going just as I planned. It's almost a miracle that I haven't had any deviations from the schedule. That's usually the case. Not this time, though. Everything works just as planned, which means that if everything continues to go as planned next week, I might actually squeeze in and be available for the show again, provided that the flights arrive when they are supposed to, and provided that I can get away from here and end up in Bucharest in time. How about on your end?
Right, I'm available.
Okay. Then I guess we're going to have to pray for the next week. But until next week, how's been the weather?
Actually surprisingly good for this time of year. It's actually been just sunshine and pretty warm. Yeah, something like 25 to 30 degrees. Maybe a slightly bit on the warm side for my taste, but it's generally quite good. It's been slightly colder today, but still very good. So I can't complain.
Yeah, my coughing has gotten significantly better. I mean, I've gotten further away from Hillary Clinton tier in terms of coughing. With that said, with the weather, during the day, pretty much identical with with what you described, but during the night, man, is getting cold. Last night, the temperature went as low as 3 degrees Celsius. Very, very cold. But during the day, yeah, 25 to 30, sometimes even more than that. Today, we're actually 34 at around 3 p.m. Yeah, a bit cold for my taste, but on the other hand, I prefer that kind of weather rather than the traditional minus 24 that you can expect in this far eastern region where the very unfettered Russian style wind still reaches.
Yep.
With that said, let's get to our news. We have a reasonably big news section ish.
All right, so let's get started. The first piece of news is from The Independent from the United Kingdom. Groundbreaking fertilization technique could allow gay couples to have babies with each other. A new experiment defies nature and might one day let two males have babies with each other. The shocking new study overthrows the idea that it is only possible to produce children using an egg and fertilizing it with sperm. Instead, the research suggests that it might be possible to conceive children using skin cells. In a new experiment on mice, scientists appear to have shown that it would be possible to conceive of mice using other kinds of cells. The study showed that it was possible to produce healthy offspring while bypassing the normal route of fertilizing an egg with sperm. The stunning result could mean that it would be possible to fuse sperm with ordinary cells like skin or other tissue without using cloning to produce babies. As such, it could lead the way to human reproduction that completely cuts the female part of the process. Scientists have called such a scenario speculative and fanciful, but haven't ruled it out. If that happened, it would allow gay biological men to have children with each other, for instance. And it would allow a man to fertilize his own cells with his own sperm, producing offspring that would use only his genes and those inherited from his parents. But more immediately, the finding could suggest that women whose fertility has been wiped out by cancer drugs or other treatments still have their own children using another of their cells. At the moment, people in that situation can only have children of their own if the eggs were frozen before treatment. After they are lost, there's nothing that can be done. And the same treatment could allow for the preservation of endangered species, since it allows scientists to get around the often complicated and difficult process of collecting eggs from those that they wish to help to breed. Instead, they could just use sperm and somatic cells. Quote, Our work challenges the dogma held since early embryologists first observed mammalian eggs around 1827 and observed fertilization 50 years later, that only an egg cell fertilized with a sperm cell can result in live mammalian birth, said lead scientist Tony Perry, a molecular embryologist from the University of Bath. But Dr. Perry has also made clear that tests on mice only prove that the technique would work in principle. Much more work will have to be done before it can be technically feasible, he said. The experiments used pathogenote mouse embryos that were created by scientists. Those are all female embryos made without any sperm, created by tricking an egg into developing as if it was fertilized. Usually, those embryos die after a few days because they're not properly programmed. But in the new studies, scientists found that they could inject them with sperm and transform them into normal embryos, and let them go on to produce healthy offspring. The study produced 30 mouse pups with a success rate of 24%. That is far above the 1 or 2% success rate usually found in the traditional method of cloning by transferring DNA to donated eggs. That finding matters because parthenogenes are similar to other ordinary cells like skin cells. Both are mitotic, and if living offspring can be produced from the one, then it should be possible to create them from the other using the same technique. But the scientists will have to do further research to check whether that actually works. Quote, the practical applications of this as technology stands at the moment are not very broad, Dr. Perry said at the press conference. What we're saying is that these embryos are meiotic cells. Meiotic cells are the type of cell that almost every dividing cell in your body is. And therefore, potentially, one day we might be able to extend what is shown in these meiotic cells to other meiotic cells. Will we be able to do that? I don't know. But I think if it is ever possible, one day in the distant future, people will look back and say, this is where it started.
Well, hashtag triggered.
Very triggered. They are trying to erase women from the reproductive process.
If this were to work, and kudos to the Independent, I never thought I would hear myself saying that, but at the very least, the article is very balanced. I mean, yeah, sure, the headline is a little bit on the clickbait side, but then again, you want people to read your garbage. Nevertheless, the article is very well balanced. But if this were to work, this would definitely be a significantly superior approach than artificial wombs, methinks.
Yeah, if you would still need some sort of artificial womb if you want to have a baby that's created from cells from two men, the child will still need to grow somewhere.
Hmm. Yeah, but at the very least, I mean, the problem with artificial wombs is that it still requires uh, eggs to be fertilized from an actual woman. But if this were to be proven itself viable as a technology, that could change the game the quote unquote game, of course, fundamentally to levels that we can't even begin to fathom at this point. Now, admittedly, we're still very far from that. I mean, even if everything works great, we're still looking at, I don't know, maybe 30 years from now, at the very least, to have this viable. But nevertheless, it's a little bit unsettling and triggering.
Yeah, but I think it's great news, and it's great what advances are made constantly in science. Whether this will actually pan out, I have no idea. Probably it won't, but maybe it might. Of course, with these kinds of headlines, um, and to be fair, the article does include a number of caveats and says that it's fanciful and speculative and so on. So probably nothing's going to come of it, but if it does pan out, it's going to be great. I think that's
Yeah,
will make
yeah,
a lot of things easier.
the article, I mean, the quote from the scientist is great. I mean, will we able to do that? I don't know, but if we will, sometime in the future, Everyone will look back and say, "Oh, that's where it started in 2016." In the current year, um, some mad scientists in the lab have managed to do it. Yeah, if it does, look, as far as I'm concerned, sooner or later, one of these things will pan out. Uh, One way or the other, eventually, reproduction will become to be like that. The question is, will it be useful for humans or not? And that depends on how. Uh, I would dare to say society, even though I steer clear on using such broad terms. But it does depend on how society will look like. Because if society will continue to look very gynocentric in the way it looks today, then there will be enough demand, market demand for such technologies. If not, then such technologies will only be used on, I don't know, endangered species and things of that nature.
It also depends a lot on how people will view these kinds of techniques, whether there's going to be some sort of stigma against children created by these unnatural means, or
Hmm.
whether it's something that's going to be more or less accepted and
Hmm.
maybe even normal. Maybe at some point in time, women will just say, "I don't want to get pregnant. I don't want to walk around with a month of my life bearing this great burden. I'll just have this artificial womb and still have a child that's biologically mine in the same sense it would be otherwise, just not carrying it around for months on end. Maybe that's just going to be the normal way people reproduce, and only some eccentric people who are uh, don't trust modern technology or something will choose for natural birth. I don't know. That's quite possible.
Hmm. It is quite possible, and dare I say, quite likely. I'm not sure. I'm not convinced that's necessarily a good thing, because after all, when this is true with the government, as same is true with technology. Anything that can give you anything can also take everything away from you. This is why, for instance, I, as an expert in IT security, I'm the person that trusts the least in modern technology. That's why I'm the Neanderthal that always uses cash and never ever does electronic payments. And this is precisely because I know how they work, and I know that security and privacy are just fancy words that don't exist. Same goes with pretty much any kind of technology. There are trade offs there, and if the general population decides to accept them, then that's of course going to change the general paradigm. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's always a good thing. Most of the times it is, sometimes it isn't. And with reproduction, it's a bit more complex. It's easier to convince people to pay with the plastic for their donuts in their lunch break. It's a lot harder to convince people to trust a machine with their babies, because at the end of the day, yes, women can say that and may legitimately have a case in that regard. But nevertheless, there are, I mean, humans in general and women in particular are quite wired to want to have their children, well, with them at all times. I mean,
Yeah,
this is particularly true in Europe. I mean, in the United States, assisted births and more usage of modern technology within the process of giving birth are a lot more common than in Europe. In Europe, both East and West, natural birth without C sections and especially natural birth at home is very widespread, a lot more widespread than in North America. So I don't know. This is probably one of the aspects where we in Europe are far more conservative than North America.
yeah. Also, in terms of the technology, I think it's a question of how well any sort of artificial womb would be able to recreate the natural environment you have um, inside a woman's womb, because the
Hmm.
baby gets all sorts of things from the mother, sorts of uh, gets immunized against various diseases, and also
There's a
other things
huge chemical cocktail going on
yeah
there.
that
Yes.
things that happen inside the womb that influence the child during its development, and how well these can be recreated inside of an artificial womb is of course very much an open question. Of course, maybe it might even create a better environment for children that reduces the risk of diseases developing and so on. That's
Mhm.
quite possible. We just have to wait and see how good that technology will get.
Yeah, and let's not forget that even the tiniest mistake, or not necessarily mistake, but even the tiniest variation can produce radically different outcomes. I mean, we already know that intrauterine influences can change very broad things, up to and including differences in height, differences in sexual orientation, differences in propensity towards various sorts of diseases. Even the tiniest variation can change these things. Now, admittedly, with technology, we could control these things better, but we're probably going to have to conduct these experiments in India or something, because in Europe, almost any kind of experiment like this is ipso facto illegal, thanks to quote unquote ethical concerns. Because that's
Yep.
the problem is science has been advancing at a much slower pace in the last 20 or 30 years because of these quote unquote ethical guidelines. Now, I'm not saying that having ethics in science is a bad thing. No, I'm all for it, but we're probably going way too far with that.
Yeah, that's sort of my impression too.
Mm. Right, let's go to Mr. Ali Fogg. Oh my god.
Okay, this next piece is from The Guardian. Why does the CPS report on violence against women include men in the stats? Male violence against women is both a cause and a consequence of gender inequality in this country and across the world. It is right and essential that official bodies strive to reduce and eliminate such offences as an end in itself and as part of a broader strategy to combat gender-based injustice. Now that we've got the feminist drivel out of the way, let's start with the actual article. The Crown Prosecution Services has just published its annual performance review titled Violence Against Women and Girls Crime Report. This year, for the first time, tucked away in parentheses on the front page are 7 new words, inclusive of data on men and boys. Readers might wonder how crimes against women and girls can include men and boys. The answer lies in a curiously bureaucratic definition. Violence against women and girls, or VAWG, doesn't necessarily mean violence against women and girls. It means a subset of criminal offences that have been categorized as VAWG crimes. Rape and sexual assault, domestic violence, human trafficking, forced marriage, etc., and the victims of these crimes are not all female. As the introduction makes clear, 1 in 6 victims described in the report are in fact men and boys. In the largest category, domestic abuse, exactly 16.7% of victims where gender was recorded are male. Elsewhere, the figures are higher. Almost a quarter of victims of so-called honor crimes are male, and in the category of trafficking and prostitution, a full 40% of victims are men and boys. But it is the most sensitive areas of sexual violence and child abuse where the situation is most troubling. Here, the CPS's data collection is so inadequate that it is impossible to officially state the gender ratio of victims. They are simply assumed to be female. In fact, the limited data that is available in the appendix shows 1 in 8 rape victims and more than a quarter of child abuse victims to be male. Those who work with male survivors of these crimes testify that issues of gender and sexuality are often central to trauma and recovery, with survivors dealing with a sense of emasculation or isolation, feeling that due to being the wrong gender, they barely even exist as victims. It is not difficult to see how government bodies categorizing these often young and deeply vulnerable men as women and girls is tantamount to another abusive act. Furthermore, male survivor charities and campaigns are desperately frustrated by a lack of reliable data, which they urgently need to make a fair and compelling case for funding, support, and donations. These issues are not restricted to the Crown Prosecution Service. As we have been reminded just this week, services to address violence against women are in crisis. One of the few lifelines is the government's Violence Against Women Fund, which worth £80 million over 5 years. Every penny, and then some, is desperately needed by women's organizations. And yet, when charities working with male survivors of rape or domestic abuse need their own support, this is the fund which they are told to apply. This is abhorrent. It takes precious funding away from women's causes, and it makes male survivors invisible treating them as an afterthought or an irrelevance. Perhaps worst of all, it pits male and female survivors against each other in an ignominious competition for funding. There might be a temptation for some to simply strip away the gender politics from intimate crimes, to describe them and address them as gender neutral or even gender free. From discussions with friends and colleagues in both the men's and women's sectors, it is clear this is something almost nobody wants. Just as there's political and social context to violence against women and girls, there's a different but no less relevant context to intimate violence against men. Male victims of gender-specific issues and needs that can be fundamentally different to those of women. No one is helped by ignoring or wishing those contexts away. In recent years, men's charities have begun to refer increasingly to gender-inclusive policies, meaning policies that acknowledge and address the relevant gender issues in both survivors and support and reduction strategies. Government bodies need to learn that just tacking men and boys onto women's issues like an awkward appendix is the polar opposite of a genuinely gender-inclusive approach. It is good and necessary that government bodies quantify and describe violence against women and girls accurately and fully. Efforts to reduce and ultimately eliminate such crimes should be assisted and applauded. These efforts are hindered, not helped, by clumsily bundling men and boys into the statistics and strategies. Male survivors are entitled to recognition and support of their own. Those men and boys and their representatives in campaigns and charities did not ask to be treated like this. They were not consulted on this, did not consent to this, and have repeatedly pleaded with the government bodies not to treat them in this way. To continue to do so is contemptible and cruel.
Well, are we having the first Ali Fogg article that is less than 100% drivel? That's astounding. I mean, it's quite a performance. With the exception of the first paragraph, which is 500% drivel, the rest of it is almost sensible. Now, of course, there are the usual mishaps in the thought process that are to be expected from any feminist author, no matter how fair, quote unquote fair, the feminist author might pretend he or she is. Although in the case of Ali Fogg, I could say she. Anyway, yeah, he has a point, I guess. The elephant in the room that he doesn't seem to address is the fact that this particular report will simply be used the same way we've seen Canadian feminists using such reports, namely to just count all the victims of a particular crime, let's say domestic violence, both men and women, and then use it to make huge billboards that say, I don't know, 1 million women have been affected by domestic violence last year. If you remember 2 years ago when Danny Boy was having his huge campaign in Canada that ended up in the national MSM, his main point was, hold on a second, your billboard has a problem. Half of those numbers are actually men. And it was the same thing that is now apparently being institutionalized in Britain too, namely that they basically lumped men and women together and created a report that is largely useless for non-feminists.
Yeah, and the sort of justification they're using that this is a technical definition and so on, bullshit. It's just a completely misleading way of putting it. It's not violence against women and girls. It's if you want to call it something, they call it, I don't know, domestic violence or sexual violence or something like that. But it's not violence against women and girls if the victims are not exclusively women and girls.
Yeah,
that's just bullshit.
Yeah, it's and he says that. Hold on a second. How does it call it? Curiously bureaucratic definition. No, I'm not buying it. I rather think it's just intentional obfuscation by feminist ideologues in various bureaucracies. And even the Guardian admits that there's just too many bloody feminists in the bureaucracies. I mean, even Ali Fogg has had an article, I don't know, 6 or 8 months ago, when he said that there may be a problem, that the fact that there is an echo chamber in the bureaucracy, just too many bloody feminists everywhere, and no dissenting voices of any kind. So I think it's intentional. I don't think it's a traditional mistake that you can expect from a bureaucracy. I would have agreed that it's maybe just a mistake that sometimes occurs in bureaucracies if for some reason it affected other types of definitions as well. But since that hasn't happened, I'm rather willing to think it's intentional, or at the very least, not if not necessarily intentional with an evil ha ha ha, where look what we're doing thing, but rather a generalized bias that has been translated uh, into a bias in the next report.
Yeah, just imagine, for example, that the military recorded instances of casualties of soldiers being injured or killed as violence against fighting men.
Yeah.
How long do you think that that would stand? Even though in this case it is in fact almost exclusively men who are the victims.
Mm-hmm. And it will probably stand a year tops. I mean, one edition of the report, and the next one will have to include 5 pages of apologies before going to the actual report. Uh, and that's me being optimistic. They'll probably force the military to withdraw the report and draw up a new one in the same year. But yes, I'm. And with regards to um, honor killing, where is this? Oh yeah, almost a quarter of victims of so-called honor crimes are male. Well, actually, that's probably being very, very conservative, because as we know from reading, the actual news, the actual Islamic news, most of the so-called honor killings actually include murdering the quote-unquote adulterous couple. So I would expect to be very, very equal. I mean, honor killing is an equal opportunity and an equal outcome crime. Horrific as it is, it's not about ha ha ha, we're going to oppress women and kill them. It's just not the way the Islamic honor system works.
Yeah, the statistics I've heard of this previously put it at much more equal, like much closer to 50-50.
Hmm.
So I wouldn't trust this one quarter figure here.
Yeah, same goes with the trafficking and prostitution. I mean, I mean, I presume that forced trafficking for sexual purposes occurs in the United Kingdom by two different categories. I think on one hand, there's legitimate hookers who are sometimes counted as victims of trafficking, even though they're not, and young children who are obviously trafficked to be used by legitimate sexual predators. And the boys in that category are most probably trafficked towards, come on, let's be honest, towards Pakistani men whose
I think he
culture.
meant to say Asians.
Yeah, yeah. There's the Asian gangs. No, two Pakistani men who practice the bakabazi, which is one of the most abhorrent practices. Which, by the way, is not Islamic. It's actually older than Islam, but nevertheless has been included in the Pakistani flavor of Islam. But yeah, I mean, and we since we're at the trafficking portion. Um, Discussion. This is another thing that and admittedly, in this case, there is an internal struggle within feminism to a certain extent. There are quite a lot of bureaucrats and legislators and generally feminist ideologues who basically include all prostitutes, all female prostitutes, as victims of human trafficking, which is rarely the case, especially in England or in Germany or anywhere in Europe, to be fair. I mean, from Moscow to Lisbon, if you want. It's just not the case. I mean, these people genuinely think that there is no such thing as people, women in particular, wanting to willingly work in the sex industry.
Yeah, and that's just such an insane and incredibly patronizing assumption that we shouldn't even take that kind of thing seriously. It's just ludicrous.
Yeah, it is. It is. I don't know, but generally, in this particular instance, I'll have to agree with Ali Fogg that lumping all of these together and not making any sort of difference kind of defeats the purpose. Now, admittedly, I think Ali Fogg got it right for the wrong reasons, because as far as I'm concerned, the so-called 80 million pound fund, whatever, I think that's just meh, not really that relevant. The relevant part is that the report is called "Violence Against Women and Girls." I mean, at the very least, if it was, I don't know, the sexual violence national annual report or something like that, probably the whole thing would have been significantly less shit, I have to say, problematic. Damn it, social justice warriors, you ruined the language. Yeah, I mean, if it had been dubbed as, I don't know, national sexual violence victimization report or something like that, probably the whole situation would have been less problematic. But in this particular situation, it does provide ammunition for feminist propaganda with data that will most likely be quoted mistakenly and wrongly and sometimes intentionally so.
Yeah, and I can't help but think that this is intentional. That the way they framed this is so that it
Hmm.
can be misquoted.
Hmm. 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 I mean, I don't know. Let's call it now and see if we're going to be proven wrong. We are in September. Probably by December, if not, then definitely by January or February, we're going to see at least one major feminist organization in the United Kingdom quoting this report and saying that, I don't know, 100,000 women have been affected by domestic violence, and they will just take the total number of victims from this report without looking into the parentheses and the appendix and so on and so forth. I think that is bound to happen. I would be surprised if that will not happen.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, with regards to the one, hold on a second. Let me find the quote. Yeah, one of the few lifelines is the government's violence against women fund worth 80 million pounds over 5 years. Uh, yeah, no. Uh, the the thing is that this fund used to be much bigger, and thanks to conservatives like Mr. Philip Davies and others, we already know. I mean, we did report it every step of the way in this show that the UK government has slashed quite a lot of funding for these feminist-oriented shelters. They basically told them, "Look, you're either going to offer services for men too, or you're on your own with finding funding because the government, the taxpayers, will no longer support your quote-unquote work." And apparently, that's problematic for Ali Fogg. I mean, in his opinion, they should be kept. The funding should also be kept sex segregated. Now, I would agree with Ali Fogg in general that there are indeed not gender specific but sex specific needs for victims of the male sex and victims of the female sex. But I don't agree that the funding should necessarily be kept sex segregated, at least not when it comes to taxpayers' money. Sure, private donations, fine, do whatever you please. But with taxpayers' money, not so convinced.
Yeah, I also like the argument he provides is that like, there is an argument. He just says that it's better because reasons, and other people also agree. That's
Yeah,
basically his argument.
yeah, yeah. Some people agree that we should burn witches. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a good idea. Just saying.
And then later on he deplores um, that the male and female survivors are pitted against each other in an ignominious competition for funding, but that is, I mean, precisely what you do if you have a sex segregated um, funding for domestic violence and so on. And
Hmm.
you have this amount allotted to women and this amount allotted to men. Um,
Mhm.
if you set up like this, you still get this competition for funding. I mean,
Yeah. And competition for funding is a fact of life for every single advocacy group out there. It doesn't matter if it's the Save the Whales group or a group that tries to alleviate the issues created by domestic violence. I mean, competition for funding is not something that's going to go away anytime soon. We're a civilization with limited resources and unlimited needs. Uh, is it really that complicated?
yeah, I mean, there's just never going to be enough money to do everything. It's just not never going to happen. And
Yes.
if you want to say that there's not enough funding for this, and you have to um, pick something else that has too much funding, or you're going to say you have to have higher taxes. You have to have to get the money somewhere.
Yeah. Well, I guess Ali Fogg would never object to higher taxes, being the socialist Bolshevik guy that he is when it comes to economics. I mean, I've never seen anyone who understands free markets less than Ali Fogg. I mean, you can look up on his Guardian handle and see whenever he talks about economics, he makes Krugman and Piketty sound like far righters in comparison, and that's hard. I wouldn't put it past him to just advocate. Okay, we just need bigger taxes for my pet cause. Um, he at one moment, hold on, yeah, two paragraphs before the end of it. It takes precious, this is a quote, it takes precious funding away from women's causes and it makes male survivors invisible, treating them as an afterthought or an irrelevance, end quote. I'm sorry, but this has been going on since the whole concept of helping male victims of domestic violence has become a thing. That is, since Erin Pizzey started her work 40 years ago, 40 something years ago. I mean, this is not something that is suddenly happening now because some feminist bureaucrat manipulated the definitions in this particular report. This has been the natural state of things, quote unquote, natural state of things in the United Kingdom for at the very least 40 years.
Yeah, isn't the patriarchy marvelous?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he sounds like he discovered that the water is wet. I, really? Welcome to our world. I mean, we've known this for so long that we're having a hard time being surprised, and we're having a hard time uh, believing in the sincerity of the complaint. Now, I wanted to look at the comments section, but then I found out that the first 20 comments had been deleted for being too triggering. So I don't know what the commentary at the Guardian believes about this because I didn't have the time to just read all of them. And after the first 20 messages of this comment has been deleted for being too truthful, I just had to drop the investigation there. Anyway, since we're at the topic of feminists turning bureaucracies against common sense and basic human decency, the next article is well, it's on the Daily Mail, but it's basically an opinion piece by Laura Perrins, an attorney in the United Kingdom. The feminists who are turning British justice against men, writes barrister Laura Perrins. Very good article. I cut a little bit from it because it's just too bloody long, but nevertheless is generally good. It goes like this, quote, "The Crown Prosecution Service is meant to be one of the guardians of the British public. Its duty is to tackle criminality without bias, regardless of the background of either perpetrator or victim. Its guiding spirit should be the famous blindfolded figure of justice that stands on top of the Old Bailey, reflecting the ideal that we're all equal before the law. But as a barrister myself, I fear the service is sliding towards the status of a noisy pressure group in the grip of feminist dogma. No longer the stern, impartial bulwark of our legal system, it now appears to be increasingly driven by fashionable politics and ideological fads. That's certainly the outlook that shines through the CPS's annual report on violence against women and girls, published earlier this week. In triumphant language, the document spells out a lengthy catalogue of success for the modern feminist agenda. Quote, More than 100,000 defendants were prosecuted for domestic abuse, with over 75,000 convicted, the highest volumes ever recorded, reads one passage. Quote, domestic abuse, rape, and sexual offenses now account for nearly 19% of our workload, an increase over the past 6 years from just under 9%, declares another. Much of this focus on offenses against women has been driven by the Director of Public Prosecutions, Alison Saunders, who took up her post in November 2013 and has since been regularly embroiled in controversies over her decisions, such as her refusal to prosecute the late Labour peer Lord Jenner on multiple allegations of paedophilia. But in her attachment to a doctrine brand of feminism that is the most disturbing feature of her CPS leadership. This is the public official who stated last year that any woman who wakes up in bed with a man with no memory of the previous evening because of drunkenness should go to the police if there is even the slightest suspicion that an assault may have been committed. In the same politically correct tones, she has published complex guidelines on sexual consent, which she boasted, quote, take us well beyond the old saying that no means no, end quote. In Miss Saunders' Brave New World, a rape suspect may have to show the steps he took to establish that consent was, quote, fully and freely given, close quote, which rather inverts the age-old British tradition, innocent until proven guilty. Hardline feminists may be glorying in Miss Saunders' tenure. The rest of us should surely be concerned that the organization is in danger of losing its sense of purpose and proportion. I am not, of course, arguing that crimes against women should not be prosecuted with the full rigor of the law. In the name of genuine justice, such an approach is essential, and it is true that in the past, prosecutors often ignored offenses such as rape within marriage and domestic violence. But what profoundly concerns me is the CPS's lack of balance. Amid all the eagerness to celebrate the prosecution of offensive tweeters and misogynistic bloggers, the questions have to be asked. Are similar resources being put into the fight against other crimes, such as theft or burglary? Is the same energy devoted to incidents where men are overwhelmingly the victims? Grievous bodily harm, for example? The feminist lobby likes to talk grandly about gender equality, but the reality is that in this focus on women's rights, men increasingly receive a raw deal. In practice, the CPS and much of the rest of the political establishment now gives the impression that offenses against women are treated with more robustness than those against men. We see that in the rash of new legislation designed to meet the demands of the feminist creed. Indeed, the CPS report this week is full of references to recent laws, including the Malicious Communications Act, under which revenge porn cases are prosecuted, and the offense of controlling and coercive behavior, which is aimed at domestic abuse. Yet most of this legislation is not necessary, since personal abuse and harassment are already against the law. The feminist lobby is endlessly demanding new laws to signal their virtue and campaigning zeal, and the CPS under Alison Saunders is only too happy to accommodate them. A prime example is the legislation against female genital mutilation. There was no need for yet another act, for this vile form of misogynistic torture was already covered by a host of measures, such as the Offences Against the Person Act of 1861. Predictably, it has had no impact beyond garnering favorable headlines from progressive newspapers such as The Guardian. There has not been a single successful prosecution. The only attempt to bring charges against London doctor Danuson Damascena was a farcical case that rightly ended in humiliating failure when the jury acquitted him in just 25 minutes. With this shameful record, it is a bit reach of the CPS to now posture as the champion of female emancipation. The CPS's strategy is not only unfair to men, who are, in fact, by far the biggest targets of crime, but it also undermines the concept of due process under the law, one of the pillars of our justice system. When referring to offenses against women, Alison Saunders and her underlings peddle political jargon about the problem of so-called victim blaming, where a woman is blamed for a sexual assault against her, as if the only reason more prosecutions are not secured is because the criminal justice system is insufficiently feminist. Such an insidious approach ignores the age-old notion of establishing the burden of proof. A rape suspect sometimes walks free not because of victim blaming by the defense, but because he's genuinely innocent. But perhaps the biggest disservice of all is done to women themselves. The CPS appears determined to create a mood of infantilized hysteria where threats lurk for women around every corner and where masculinity is nothing but a reservoir of violent anger. Ms. Saunders said on Tuesday that social media had built a new landscape for controlling sexually motivated or other forms of interpersonal offending. Yet the internet has also been a tremendous force for liberation, helping modern women to enjoy more choices and freedom than in any previous generation. Within this relentless message, the CPS seems to want to trap women in victimhood, wiping up fears and exaggerating dangers. There is something offensive about its urge to sweep all kinds of crime, from brutal rape to nasty texts, into one vast category of female misery. the shallow the shallowness at the heart of this outlook was highlighted recently by a CPS campaign against rape, which compared sexual consent to having a cup of tea. Quote, you wouldn't force or pressure someone into having a cup of tea, and you can tell when someone wants a cup of tea or not, said Ms. Saunders in pushing the initiative. That's the naive quality of argument and poor leadership we have to endure in our legislation. This week's intellectually flawed report simply reinforces how badly her service has lost its way.
An outstanding article.
Yeah, this author in particular, this barrister, we've read some of her articles in the past, and she usually has quite a few slips of thought that are, at the very least, mildly incongruent with reality. But this time, I really tried when I decided to include this one in the segment. I really tried to find something wrong with it, and I couldn't.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that calling FGM a misogynistic torture. I don't know if it's actually misogynistic, and it's not
It's,
really torture. I mean, it's not really meant to be something that harms the quote unquote victim. It's I mean I believe that it's harmful, and most people in the Western world believe it to be harmful, but people who practice it actually think they're helping the girls that they're mutilating. And I don't really think it's misogynistic in most cases. So
mm,
I wouldn't use these kinds
yeah,
of languages, but that's a minor thing.
yeah, but then again, you have to imagine for what audience the article is written. I mean, I do this all the time when I write. When I know for sure what kind of audience will read or watch what I say, I try to tailor the message a little bit to that audience. With that said, whether it is meant as torture or not, and I agree with you entirely that it is not meant as torture, the result sometimes is. Now, again, the problem with the female circumcision is that the generalized pop culture discourse is usually uh, disconnected from reality. I mean, there are several different types of female circumcision or female genital mutilation, and some of them are definitely way outside of the of what we generally understand as torture, and some of them are definitely correctly identified as torture. It really does depend on the geographical area and the culture in which they're taking place. Uh, so, yeah, some of them are indeed torture, some of them are not. And the same goes with male circumcision. I mean, they're all mutilation, but they're not all torture. Um, some of them are worse than others. I mean, even evil has its degrees of harm inflicted. For instance, in South Africa, where is that quote unquote tradition in which the village chases and catches young boys in their as in age 11, 12, 13, and forcibly circumcises them. That's definitely far closer to torture than the far less invasive, though equally contemptible practices that occur in certain synagogues. Because one dirty aspect of male circumcision, for instance, is that the quote unquote medical circumcision is actually more invasive than the ones conducted ritualistically in in synagogues. So yeah, the same goes with FGM. Mm, Maybe most likely it's not misogynistic because that's definitely not the intent. But some of them are indeed torture, some of them are not.
Yeah, but as I said, that's a very minor point. It was just sort of a throwaway comment, really.
Yeah,
Um,
but other than that, I find it hard to. I mean, I was looking for, of course, uh, factual mistakes, and I've yet to find one. I mean, it is true that since 2013, the practice of the process, I mean, laws haven't changed that much in Britain in the last 3 or 4 years, but the practice has changed quite significantly on the part of the state. I mean, at the very least, when I started doing this show, there wasn't such thing as being criminally prosecuted for offending a feminist on Twitter. That just wasn't on anyone's radar. I mean, and in 2012, we were still reading about very weird cases from the Netherlands where sometimes some zealous prosecutor would try to prosecute someone for daring to offend a Muslim on Twitter. And that was usually restricted to the Netherlands and sometimes in Austria, but it was very weird and very rare. Now it's kind of the norm, and not just in these two countries, it's kind of the norm almost all over the former Western Bloc.
yeah, that practice is definitely spreading, and I think it's especially gotten bad in the UK.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, if we are to look even beyond the sexism thingy, the amount of people bothered by the police for daring to have less than gushing and less than politically correct opinions about the migrant crisis. Same thing. That was just not a thing that used to happen 4 years ago. Now it's almost every week we can find in the media one or two new cases of these. Now, admittedly, most of them eventually end up in acquittal, but nevertheless, the fact that they're happening should be worrying in and of itself.
Yep.
All right, then since we don't have anything to argue with this lady,
Yeah, that's
let's
sort
go.
of the thing when you sort of agree with someone on almost everything. There's just not a lot to say about it.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
kind of a problem because
that's
it
problematic.
sort of makes things very negative. Because when you disagree with someone, there's lots of things you can say, but there's only so many ways you can say I agree with this person.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I guess we are negativistic in our own right, aren't we?
Yeah.
Okay. Then let's go to the next one. Another lady from the Muffington Post this time.
Yep, it's from the Huffington Post. 76% of UK suicides are male. Why? Today, on World Suicide Prevention Day, the focus is male suicide. Suicide is currently the single biggest killer of men aged under 45 in the UK, and men are nearly 4 times more likely than women to take their own life. And members of the National Suicide Prevention Alliance, 70 organizations from the private, public, and voluntary sectors, are calling upon men to seek help when they're down or in crisis. It is great that we are, finally and collectively, encouraging men to get support. But surely the big, currently unanswered question is why men? Various theories are bandied about, but the extraordinary truth is that we don't know. There's lots of speculation, snippets of information, theories, but no actual nuggets. But unless we do understand why more men take their lives, then how can we possibly target and respond effectively? We need data to work. We need data to work effectively, hone our targeting, refine services so they fit the audience, ensure those who need help can access it. And if there are environmental factors impacting men, then take action to mitigate such factors. The issue isn't much different than how it was 10 years ago when suicide was then the single biggest killer of aged under 35 and 70% of all suicides were male. It has taken a decade of relentless campaigning to get the issue raised publicly. So now we've got awareness, or at least got a body of steam underway. But we still precious little in the way of robust data and too many unanswered questions. In 2012, the government announced a commitment of £1.5 million for suicide research. This figure is less than the estimated costs of one single suicide in the UK. To put this in context, there were more than 6,000 suicides in 2014, so suicide is now costing us in the region of $10 billion a year. The $1.5 million spent on research was not unwelcome, of course, and many important initiatives were identified. But not a penny was spent asking the question, why men? The assumption is that it's all too easy to understand the gender bias in suicide. Remember those lazy truisms? Men drink more, visit the doctor less, and take more fatal methods. And yet the female suicide rate has halved since the early 1980s. The problem doesn't then appear to simply be biological. We have to go beyond these surface indicators and ask what is really going on. We know the expectation that real men should be strong, silent, and in control is a huge barrier to men seeking help. But even still, just telling men to get help doesn't in itself take us very far. How do we actually prevent male suicide and what is driving these suicides? Poverty, divorce, being a breadwinner are good thoughts, but women face the same issues. So why men? Is it more about society? Is it at least in part biology? Are there environmental factors such as testosterone-reducing drugs, which might explain at least some of this? The problem isn't just that we don't know. The problem is that we're not even asking the question, which 10 years on from when Calm first started pushing on this feels unreal. Men all over the country have led the charge to raise awareness. In November last year, Calm reached more than 100 million online with our Bigger Issues campaign. Recently, we've been thrilled to support Luke Ambler, founder of Andy's Man's Club, and his It's Okay to Talk social media campaign. And this speaker sat around the table with the most influential organizations in suicide prevention, such as Network Rail and Samaritans, to pool knowledge and experience. And the big question raised were about data. Today is a wake-up call for male suicide to be taken seriously. 12 men die at their own hands every day. 76% of lives lost to suicide in the UK are male. Telling men to reach out for help isn't enough. The question still lies unanswered. Why men?
Well, that's quite of a mixed bag of an article, isn't it? Uh,
Definitely, definitely.
I it has a point where it says that relying on lazy truisms such as men drink more, visit the doctor less, whatever, is not good enough. Although we should be noting, because since this is a UK focus episode and the article is about the United Kingdom, uh, lately women have started drinking so much that they might have already outpaced men. Yet, as the article notes, the female suicide rate has halved since the early 1980s. So either alcohol has a radically different effect on women than on men, which might be true. I don't know. Maybe that's true. Or alcohol consumption is not necessarily a factor and definitely not a relevant factor. Either of these could be true. I don't know. Um, Never. As for taking more fatal methods, that's definitely true in the case of men. Uh, I don't know why. Again, and I think, but I suspect it is biological because if we are to look at killers, no, not suiciders, but killers, people who consciously, intentionally choose to kill another human being. If the killer is female, it is very likely that the method chose to kill someone else is something indirect, as in poisoning, as in setting up traps, things of that nature. Whereas if the killer is male, the method chosen is usually a lot more direct, such as a weapon, a firearm, a sword, just simply smashing the opponent's head, methods that are more direct. And I think that this is something that is biological because it has been consistent for so long uh, since we've known about this in history. I mean, even in the 1700s, female killers were using poison and other sorts of indirect methods, whereas male killers, used more direct methods. So it kind of stands to reason that the same trend would apply when individuals choose to kill not someone else but themselves. Um, with that said, the attempt of at explaining things by this author is on the bullshit end of the spectrum. I mean, it says here poverty, divorce, or being a bad breadwinner are good thoughts, but women face the same issues. No, they don't. No, they don't. When it comes to poverty, uh, usually in Britain, I don't have the data for last year, but 2 years ago it was around 72% of the people below the poverty line were male. Homelessness is 90% male. Being a breadwinner is not and never has been an expectation for women. It has always been a male issue. So no, women do
And
not face the same issues. They
and
just don't.
as far as divorce goes, of course, out of necessity, women and men get divorced about the same amount, but it affects men and women very differently because typically after a divorce, when there's children, the woman gets to keep the children, while the man does not. Maybe gets to see them on the weekend or something, but um, usually does not get equal custody or even sole custody. Um, so
Not to mention the assets division post divorce enforced usually by the state, which is very very unequal in most cases. And by unequal, I mean women win. And men lose. It's
yeah,
a very adversarial system and very zero sum or game oriented method that almost invariably leads to men losing. So knowing these things and then saying, oh, but women face the same issues, is at the very least disingenuous, if not outright bollocks. It's just not it's just not true. Period.
yeah.
It's not true. Go
Typically
ahead.
men are much more adversely affected by a divorce, and you
Hmm.
also see this in the actual suicide numbers. Suicide numbers of men after a divorce go way up,
Yes.
but women's suicide numbers don't go up nearly as much.
And they don't go up at all. They stay flat with the general population, at least in Britain. In the US, they go up slightly, but again under the statistical error thingy. Whereas, yes, with men, they go way up, like twice or thrice the general population right after the divorce. So I'm not saying that's necessarily a direct cause, but the consistent correlation um, should tell us something, and it should definitely tell the suicide prevention NGOs something, or organizations, whatever, something about the problem if they indeed want to to think about this issue seriously. And then again, if we are to look at countries with less adversarial divorce systems, like I don't know, maybe Spain more recently, or maybe Poland or Hungary, suicide rate for men does not radically go up after a divorce. So maybe, just maybe, there is something to be said about having less insane divorce courts if you want to save more lives. Just saying. And I'm not the reason I chose Hungary and Spain is because the difference in culture is different enough to suggest that there's something more than the generalized culture within the said divorces take place. There's maybe something about the way they're handled by the courts, because at the very least, the concept of divorce rape. When I say divorce rape, those living in anglophone countries know exactly what I'm talking about. But if you say divorce rape in Budapest, nobody knows what you're talking about, because in Hungary, I'm going to maintain the example with Hungary since I started. It's just not the case of leaving one spouse, whether the man or the woman, leaving them on the streets or living in a tiny studio apartment just so they can keep up with the vagina money and child support payments. It just never happens it, at all.
Yeah, and this whole thing about imprisoning when they don't make child support or alimony payments,
That's
that's
completely
not
alien.
something you see outside of the Anglophone world.
Yeah, it doesn't. I mean, is there? I don't think there is a country in continental Europe where such thing happens, like debtor's prison. I don't think it happens anywhere.
Yeah. For example, in Germany, you do have reasonably high child support payments and so on, but they're not calculated in these completely insane ways that you see in UK or United States or something like that, where sometimes people are ordered to pay uh, something like 100% of their income as in alimony and child support because
Hmm.
at the time of the divorce they had a higher income and then they've lost their job or something and they have a worse job now and now they just can't possibly make their payments and then they're thrown in jail. That's just not
Hmm.
something that happens in Germany, for example. There's a certain minimum income that you get to keep no matter what. Even if your child support payments are way higher than your income, you still get to keep um, this minimum amount, which still allows you to live on. You know, and you sort of end up owing the difference. If you ever get a better job, then you have to pay that off. But at least you're not going to jail. You're not going to become homeless.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, it's. I have a friend who's uh, paying child support. Now, admittedly, this friend of mine is not a particularly spectacular example because he's in reasonably decent terms with his wife, his former wife. Now, he used to be in because that's how he ended up paying child support. They had a very nasty divorce, but now they're getting along a lot better. They finally became adults, both of them, and they realized that they need to raise their child rather than bitching and complaining about each other in front of a judge. But nevertheless, that's how I learned the minutiae of the system here. It's basically there is a minimum amount that it's I think it's about 75 or the 100 euros a month, something like that. You can't go beneath that. But there is also a maximum amount that is no more than 3,000 euros a month. I mean, even if your income is 1 million euros a month, the judge can't go above 3,000 or 3,500, something like that. Because there is such thing as at the end of the day, and I think that's very sensible because at the end of the day, you can calculate based on the prices on the market. You can calculate how much, what is the maximum amount needed for to raise a child. And when I hear in the United States cases of like $25,000 a month, and I'm like, Jesus Christ! But what the hell does that child eat?
Probably caviar every
Well,
day or something.
even if they had eaten caviar daily, there are ways to get discounts on that. It would still cost less than that. I mean, for crying out loud.
Buying caviar in bulk
Yeah, buying
with
caviar on
great cans.
yeah, I mean, seriously. And for some reason, and I don't know what is the reason, but for some reason, we in continental Europe, in our own different various ways, depending on our local cultures, because obviously continental Europe is not a unified monolithic place, no matter what the cucks in Brussels tell you. But nevertheless, virtually every country in continental Europe has somehow managed to set things up in such a way that doesn't drive people to suicide, basically, or if it does, it's less likely to happen, to a much lesser extent, to a much smaller extent than in Britain or in the United States. Now, with the divorce thing aside, uh, I personally still maintain a high dose of skepticism in general with about and try to avoid speaking about suicide because there are things that I simply don't know. And I think I've asked these questions on the air in the past, and I'll ask them again. Why, for instance, not just in Britain, but in most countries of Europe, the suicide rate for men was a lot lower in the 50s than it is today. Even though in the 50s there was a much higher reason for it to be higher. I mean, after all, in 1950, you had a huge number of men in every country of Europe that was suffering from shell shock or PTSD, as it's called these days. You had a huge number of people in general, not just men, who were affected, deeply affected by the horrors of World War II. Yet, for some reason, people sucked it up and continued with their life the best they could in the 50s. Then, now, when every single country of Europe, from the poorest to the richest, are going through probably the best period in their history.
Yeah, I also don't really have a convincing answer to that. It's I really don't know genuinely.
Try an unconvincing one. I've
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's just less of a cultural taboo against suicide, maybe for religious reasons. I mean, Europe has been becoming a lot less religious over the last couple of decades, at least in as far as Christianity is concerned. And Christianity has bans against suicides, and maybe with people becoming less religious, they also um, there's less inhibitions against suicide. That might be something, but I I don't really know if that's really all that convincing of an explanation.
Yeah, for in order to check up that argument, I should probably look and compare, I don't know, suicide rates in Poland and Romania, which are the most religious countries of Europe, versus, I don't know, Czech Republic and Sweden, which are the least religious countries of Europe. I guess that would answer the question. I don't have time to look up that now, but that could solve the mystery, or at the very least would provide the, well, maybe would not solve the mystery, but at the very least would provide an indication whether the degree of religiosity has something to do with it.
Yep. Also, before we move on with the next article, I would like to make a mathematical point. So it's 76% of UK suicides are male, but in this article they write men are nearly 4 times more likely than women to take their own lives.
They're actually
Um,
3 times.
yeah, actually, it's 2 times, which I will explain right away.
Oh yeah,
So,
you're right. Sorry.
uh, so we have this figure 76%, and they're basically, I guess, rounding it up to 80%, saying it's nearly 80%, and 80 versus 20, that's 4 times as much. But what they're writing here is 4 times more likely, which even if it's 4 times more likely, it's the same as saying 5 times as likely.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
if for example, you say it's 20% more likely, it means it's 120%,
Mm-hmm.
not 20%, because
Mm-hmm.
20% would be 80% less likely. So
Yes.
with the same logic, if it's 4 times more likely, it's actually 5 times as likely. And also, rounding 76% up to 80% is really disingenuous. It should really be rounded down to 75%. That's 3 times as likely or 2 times more likely.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's
Hashtag numbers, how do they work? And yeah, well, you don't expect these people who make their living from quote unquote social advocacy to actually know these things. You see, this is another problem with people like us. We don't make our living from social advocacy. We do these shows because we want to. We derive little to no uh, financial, usually no financial benefit from it, and we only have a moral dog in the race. We don't have a financial dog in the race. However, that's not the case with our philosophical opponents or even people who sometimes make points similar to ours. They make their living off of it, and that's sometimes not necessarily a good thing. Now, obviously, in general, it is a good thing because if you have a professional shill there whose sole job is to hammer the points home every single day, and that's his or her job, that sometimes accomplishes better results, but also leads to some sort of sloppiness. Because what's the incentive to be completely accurate? In fact, being less accurate is a good incentive because it maintains the cause and therefore maintains the source of funding, isn't it?
Yeah, and I guess bigger numbers just look more impressive. But I still don't
Yeah,
understand why they use um, this x times more way of putting it. Why not just x times as likely?
yeah.
Then you still have the big number of uh, but it's actually accurate. But
Good
yeah,
question, but then
whatever.
again, it's the Huffington Post. I
I
would
mean, with
refer.
this expression, it's really you very rarely see it actually used correctly. This
Yes.
x times more thing. But
Hmm.
if they're talking in terms of percentages, then they always use it correctly. I don't understand why, but I don't know. Maybe people just
There's
suck at maths.
Yeah, but yeah, that's basically what I was about to say. Yeah, people just suck at math, and mathematics has never been a very popular topic. I mean, go into any school, almost anywhere in Europe, and ask pupils which is the subject that they hate the most, and it's usually mathematics. Uh, I don't know. Maybe mathematics is just being poorly taught right from the get go in most schools, and as a result, most people end up sucking at maths. Or maybe just mathematics is just too bloody hard for most people.
Yeah, I don't know if it's really hard school mathematics, but I mean it's just a lot of it is just basically um, memorizing algorithms and then just um, practicing them over and over again. And then in your test, you basically um, scan the problem and you decide that which of the algorithms I've learned should I apply, and then just go do that. And doing that very quickly and efficiently is basically what gets you good grades, which has little to nothing to do with how actual mathematics is done. But yeah,
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah, it brings you good grades, but doesn't bring you good math skills. Okay, let's go to the next one. Finally, we're going a little bit away from our UK focus, going all the way up to Norway, coming from dogblooded.no. Circumcision for tende. Mission: perform unnecessary surgery on the genitals of infants. It is just to congratulate. The Norwegian government and the wide parliamentary majority has now succeeded in making unnecessary and medically unfounded surgery on infants' genitals turn it into a business. Yes, you read correctly. The Medical Center for Southeast Norway announces now that, quote, a competition among it announces now that there will be, quote, a competition among private providers with regards to ritual circumcision of boys, quote, close quote. And there is money to be made. The size of the contract is estimated to be worth at least 2 million norske kroner, excluding VAT. In return, the private provider takes on performing between 500 and 1,000 circumcisions annually. Norwegian authorities have actually ended up in a situation where they must pay private providers to perform religiously based surgery on the genitals of infants, and that concept is difficult to grasp. Yet that is exactly what has happened in a Norway which on paper is less religious than ever before. Not only has Norwegian politicians chose to disregard all technical and medical objections to the circumcision of boys, and not only do the Norwegian politicians allow religious considerations to override the religious right, override the rights of children. Shit, I should have translated this in advance. And not only this weighs once again the emotions of adults to be take to take to be considered more important than the children's body. But now they also want to monetize it. Religion and politics should definitely not be mixed. Religion and money should not be mixed. Here they have managed to mix both business, politics, and religion in a very blissful mix. The victims are a group that cannot speak for itself and that does not have anyone to assert its own interests. In a competition document for ritual circumcision of male children, by the way, a completely absurd sentence writing, provided by the Southeast Health Authority, it is even part of the announcement and a reason offered that is, quote, resistance from many in the relevant scientific community from undertaking the procedure, end quote. Therefore, the doctors in the public think it is so ethically unacceptable to inflict this senseless operation on children that they simply refuse to perform the procedure. But the resistance is not enough. Global hotspots such as the medical profession, the ombudsman of children, and nurses are so against the practice that they want a ban rather than state funding. It is added naturally, um, not naturally, however, this does not weigh at all. It has not been weighed in at all amongst our elected representatives. Religion is more important than the rights of child or the academic opinion, and more important than common sense itself. Children who at some time in their later life will be imagined to have had the foreskin intact can at least console themselves that at least someone tried. The cheapest offer should, after all, win. Basically, what it says, translation from translation, uh, the state is under very big pressure from both the Jewish and the Muslim lobby to somehow provide genital mutilation for the baby boys of these communities. And since the state doctors completely and utterly refuse to perform it, and we've been following circumcision debate in Norway for quite some time now on this show, since there's nobody willing to offer it, now the state is like, okay, we'll pay private providers somehow, so as in a way to basically get rid of the pressure that the state is being put on by the religious lobby, this particularly the Jewish and Muslim lobby. That's basically what happened.
Yeah. So basically, when it comes to commitment to socialized medicine, and that's quickly dropped as long as that interferes with being able to mutilate boys.
Yep, yep. And I don't know. I mean, it's very weird. Uh, I'm not. I'm a bit surprised that the Norwegian authorities weren't just willing to take the example from Denmark. In Denmark, coverage for circumcision has been dropped probably a decade ago, more or less, 2006, 2007, something like that. And in Denmark, something very interesting has happened. The traditionally Jewish communities in Denmark have more or less dropped circumcision altogether and replaced it with some other similar, religiously similar ritual, but that doesn't actually end up with the mutilation of an infant. And same thing was already on its way to happening, especially in the northern part of Norway, where circumcision is de facto banned at this point because there's no way to perform it unless you're willing to go all the way to the extreme south of Norway, where you can actually find a doctor willing to perform it to begin with. As I'm sure you remember, we translated several articles about that in the past. And Norway, whilst it's a sparsely populated country, barely a bit over 5 million inhabitants, territorially speaking, is quite big. So going from Tromsø to Oslo, to the capital, it's at the very least a 1 day trip, and there are no flights, so you have to go terrestrially, and it's a long trip. And surprise, surprise, many parents were like, "Come on, it's just too much of a hassle," and they dropped the idea altogether. And if this kind of de facto pressure would have been maintained a bit more, 1 or 2 more years, Norway would have gotten into the same situation as Denmark. That is to say, certain communities which would have just dropped the practice altogether because it's not, sorry, worth the hassle. But apparently, Norwegian politicians are completely oblivious to what's happening across the border to their culturally similar neighbors.
Yeah, actually, sometimes it turns out that stereotypes are very accurate. It turns out Jews actually are cheap. And I mean, in this case, it's of course a great thing.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that is what happened in Denmark. And yes, indeed, one of the other objections and one of the other reasons that Jewish communities in Denmark uh, more or less abandoned circumcision was precisely this. Not only it is very hard and we have to travel a lot to get it done, oh, even when we do, it's expensive as hell. Well, as everything in Denmark, let's be fair. I mean, there's no such thing as cheap in Denmark. Everything is bloody expensive and unreasonably so. So when you're put in front of a bill of 600 euros or more, you're like, maybe not. Same thing happened in Canada. I mean, in Canada, when the state dropped its coverage for the procedure, suddenly many parents have found some sort of a moral fiber. Oh my God, $200, that's a lot. Fuck it. No.
Yeah, and oftentimes it's these relatively trivial inconveniences and expenses that actually get people to change their behavior. And you should
Hmm.
never underestimate uh, even trivial inconvenience and expenses in altering people's behavior. And even if before they say they have some sort of deep religious commitment uh, to circumcision, once you tell them you have to travel for a whole day and it's going to cost you 500 euros in addition, then you're going to say, maybe it's not so important. Then they come up with some religious reason why it's you don't actually need circumcision after all.
Hmm. Hmm. Thing is that this author from Dog Blooded, he has a point. I mean, it's very interesting to see a wide majority in Storting in the Norwegian Parliament supporting this on a religious based, particularly in the least religious moment in the history of Norway. It's very interesting. I mean, think about it this way: Denmark and Sweden still have an official state church. Norway doesn't. And as atheistic as Sweden is, trying to propose the abolition of the state church is still very, very contentious. Whereas in Norway, it was I mean, it was the act of abolition of the state church passed, like through, like a hot iron piece through butter. I mean, it was no objection whatsoever. Yeah, of course we should do that. So, in the least religious moment of Norway, you see a wide majority of the Storting uh, being very hardline and uh, allowing this thing to happen and even being willing to spend taxpayers' money on religious motivated procedures that are also human rights breaching, amongst other things.
Yeah, I think that's actually quite surprising to me because
Hmm.
I
It
think it
is
would have
shocking
been
to me too.
it would have been quite easy for them to just say, throw their hands up, say, yeah, we're not going to ban circumcision, and we fully support your rights to get circumcised, but the doctors refused, and what are we going to do? We can't just fire everyone.
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
so as to say, our hands are bound. Sorry, Jews, sorry, Muslims. I guess you have to go to private clinics. Too
yeah,
bad.
that's what I expected to just allow private clinics to perform it, and then the state to just simply get out of the business altogether and just ignore. That's what I expected them to do. I didn't expect them to actually ban it, but I would have expected them to at least ignore the situations where pretty much the market made it banned, such as the situation in northern part of the country. I would have expected that to happen. Instead, they decided to provide perverse incentives on taxpayers' dime to make it happen again, even in areas where it wouldn't have previously happened. Because the same thing happens with doctors too. I mean, yeah, sure, the doctors that work in the state system may simply uh, refuse and whatnot, and at minimal costs to them personally. But uh, for private clinics, if there is money to be provided to them, which is usually more than the market would have provided to them by the state, that also alters people's behavior, and it alters them to the worse side rather than the better side.
Yeah.
All right, silly place time. Oh, we have 26 minutes left, so let's get slightly
Let's go to
faster.
the silly place. From the Telegraph, Boris Johnson, Parliament's serial man-spreader. Poor Boris Johnson. The Foreign Secretary has proved that he has a serious problem in his downstairs area. Every time he tries to sit, particularly when he is next to a person of the opposite gender, he's simply unable to keep his legs together. The latest example was caught on camera during the cabinet's first day of school. In 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 it, the tufty-haired minister has both legs spread firmly apart with a hand resting on each knee. On either side of him, the Education and Home Secretaries are forced to sit with their legs tightly shut. Both wear slightly strained expressions as they try and make themselves as small as possible to allow Mr. Johnson the space he demands. For Amber Rudd, the Home Secretary, it is a recurring problem. She recently had to deal with the exact issue during Theresa May's first Prime Minister's questions. While Philip Hammond made ample space for her, Mr. Johnson, yet again, spread out his legs in the familiar pose. She must be trying to avoid sitting next to him like the most unpopular kid on a school coach trip. In the new post-cabinet photo, she and Justin Greening couldn't look more uncomfortable. Both have no choice but to follow the accepted pose of legs together and hands gently clasped. Clearly, Johnson didn't get the memo. All the male politicians, of course, are photographed with their legs slightly apart. No one expects an entire mixed cabinet to look like Lego figurines. But the foreign sec really takes it to the next level. It's unclear exactly why he needs that amount of space. Does he have an issue with his legs, thighs, feet, balance? Or perhaps his male privilege is the problem. The weight of his immense burden has previously led other notable chaps to sit with their legs wide apart in what is now known as manspreading. Politicians, presidents, and even Game of Thrones actors aren't immune. Luckily, women are exempt from this phenomenon as the lack of natural privilege means their legs are able to rest side by side. But many men are tragically born with the affliction. Indeed, when Boris Johnson was at school, he was photographed sitting with his legs far apart, in the front row of the picture again, of course. Neither the male nor female cabinet ministers have spoken out about this affliction yet, but with members of the public regularly shaming manspreaders in blogs and social media, it can't be long until the same happens in Westminster. Forget the Tumblr, men taking up too much space in the train. We are now waiting for the MP version, men taking up too much space on the front bench. Oh yeah.
Yeah, the problem that I have with this article is not. I mean, if you are to take it devoid of its context, it's just funny, and it almost seems like it's a little bit tongue in cheek. The problem is that it isn't. The author, Radhika Sanghani, is a hardline feminist at the Telegraph, admittedly, one of the few surviving ones, since in July, the Telegraph had a cull within its editorial team, and most of the far leftists have been shown the door. Thank goodness, because the paper is now healthier now. But nevertheless, this particular individual has survived the culling, and uh, basically, what I want to say is that she's serious. I mean, when she says that the problem is natural privilege of Boris Johnson, she means it, and that's what makes it worthy of the silly place. I mean, imagine how complicated this woman's life is if I mean, the patriarchy is oppressing her so much that she gets to stay in an air-conditioned office to write to get shekels for writing an article in which she talks about Boris Johnson's natural privilege because he has his legs spread in a cabinet photo. And can you imagine how hard, how complicated this woman's life is?
Yeah. Also, she's sort of undermining her own argument by pointing out that he is the only man in the camera just doing this. So clearly, it's not really a problem of man spreading of something that men in general do, but it's just something that this particular man in this particular group does.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, she does say that all male members of the photo are sitting with their legs apart, but the particularly egregious
Slightly
case,
apart, yes,
yeah,
because men kind of do have external genitalia. It is a
yeah.
thing.
But don't leave don't let facts stay in your way. I mean, come on, seriously. Well, why are you being so mean? Um, but yeah, this business of man spreading is is so ludicrous that if you were to sit there and tell me 3 years ago that we would stay, well, first of all, that we would still be having a show in September 2016, I would say, oh, okay, that's interesting. But I would have been willing to believe that. I mean, I really wanted, and I still do want to make the show for as long as I'm capable and not dead, or I don't know, in some other impossibility of doing it. But if you were to say there and say, we'll be having a show in September 2016 talking about the man spreading of the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, I would just say, fuck off. That's insane. It's just not going to happen. That's retarded. I mean, not even feminists can be that retarded. That's what I would have said in 2013. Now, I'm still aghast. I guess the correct term is aghast of the fact that this whole business hasn't been drowned into an ocean of ridicule by now. I'm still aghast that the term is still being seriously used, and that there are still believers in it, and it's still being treated with anything but ridicule and contempt and dismissal. Amazing.
Yeah, it is really quite amazing. Though not necessarily the term of manspreading, but I've noticed that sort of in the popular culture, a lot of these feminist or social justice warrior terms are now being used ironically and mockingly. People talking about how they are triggered by some trivial nonsense and things like that are being mocked. But I haven't really seen that with the term manspreading, which is really quite ridiculous. And you would expect that probably to pick up sometime soon.
Yeah, you do have a point. I mean, in fairness, some other lefty SJWE terms have become punchlines in and of themselves, such as being triggered, such as cultural appropriation, and a few others have become punchlines in their own right, which is great. I mean, there's nothing that upsets a totalitarian more than the sound of a collective laughter, which is one of the reasons why the old communist regime had the biggest problem with comedians, because genuine political activists and dissenters were treated harshly, but less harshly than a comedian, because comedians were able to do the jobs of the political activists in a way that made it clear to everyone how ridiculous the regime was. And the same is true now. Laughing at the far left of at the social justice warriors is a lot more effective than seriously considering their arguments and carefully debunking them point by point with facts and whatnot. I mean, there comes a moment when careful debunking is just a waste of time.
Yeah.
All right, 17 minutes left. I hope there is enough. I'm basically not going to read the entire article, but I have to read some of it. It's behind a paywall, so you're going to have to basically trust me when I say that it says what I say it says. Coming from Dagens Nyheter, or as I like to call it, Dagens Kackheter. Uh, Gender knowledge to strengthen our defense. A new handbook produced by the Swedish Armed Forces is using gender perspective in military operations. The investment will make Sweden an international model and improve the armed forces recruitment and operational impact. No, this is serious. It is just as important as taking into account the weather and the enemy's combat value, says the chief of the effort, Jan Thörnqvist. In early September, the armed forces published a new handbook called the Gender Handbook. The new instructions occupy more than 100 pages and are part of the defense's ongoing work to promote equality. According to the armed forces definition, gender is, quote, the socially and culturally constructed notion. No, the collections of socially and culturally constructed notions of what it means to be male or female, which governs men's and women's positions and value in society. Close quote. The goal is to get a greater operational efficiency and in the workplace, says the president Jan Törnqvist about the initiative. Since April 2016, he leads the armed forces and all the efforts both in Sweden and internationally. The new manual includes both theoretical discussions about gender equality and concrete examples of how it should be implemented in operations and exercises. In one of the manual exercise scenarios, a battalion commander is to plan an attack against the enemy who occupied a strategically important port. One makes a battle plan and describes. One should make a One should make a battle plan and describe how you have integrated the gender perspective, and what account have you taken for men, women, boys, and girls situations in the planning. Says one task in the manual. As an example, he takes the man who dug a new well near a village to help the civilian population, but that well ultimately restricted the freedom of women when they no longer have to leave the village to fetch for water. I can't believe this is serious. It is important to consider these issues at every step of the way. It is just as important as taking into account the weather and the enemy combat value, added Jan Törnqvist. At the end of the month, the manual was presented, that the government's investigation into how the defense and how to tailor the new recruitment process. According to the directives, that the inquiry suggests that conscription could be partially reinstated for both men and women. We talked about this in the last episode. We must be able to recruit from the entire Swedish population, argues Törnqvist, to push this particular handbook. The focus on gender issues should place Sweden's armed forces in the front line for a more equal defense work. The focus is inter alia to prevent and stop sexual violence and harassment. In international operations, Sweden will act as a role model. Swedish dressings can also help raise awareness within multilateral organizations on the importance of gender perspectives. This can be done by developing report formats that include gender and propose the integration of gender perspective at meetings and in the plans, it also says in the manual, and has a few more paragraphs, but it's just more of the same. Oh no, here's one more. We are far ahead compared to many other countries, but there is much left to do. We will not beat our chest and say that we're ready, but it is something we must work on continually, added Jan Thörnqvist.
Well, I'm certain that they've done some scientific testing on these gender inclusive approaches, and they've tested, this with multiple units and seen that the gender inclusive approach yields a great tactical benefits to the army. So I'm
No.
fully on board with this.
Yeah, no. Remember, this is the country that had a huge problem with forest fires 2 years ago. For those wanting to read more about that, go to AVFM, and there's an article called "Sweden is Burning and We Have No Defense." That's the headline, and enjoy reading that. Basically, in 2014, the military was eventually summoned to extinguish the forest fires that have suddenly emerged in the country. Eventually, the forest fires were extinguished by private citizens, that is, men, who had their own equipment for that. And when those failed, international support had to be called in. The Danish military and the French military extinguished the forest fires in Sweden, because the Swedish military could not afford to do the job on itself, or on its own, just by itself, because they didn't have enough helicopters. They didn't have enough material to extinguish such a huge fire, because they had spent most of their funding on gender studies courses rather than, upgrading their equipment. So this is the context in which the Swedish military is now wanting to integrate gender perspective, könsperspektiv, in their quote unquote work.
You also have to take into account that before putting out a fire, it's very important to do some gender research and determine whether there aren't some women who actually would rather like that forest to burn down.
Yeah. That's a fair point.
Because I mean, forests are sort of outdoorsy places where men go to do harmful masculine things like hunting and
Cutting down trees.
cutting down trees and so on. Yeah, that's all very masculine and probably a suspect. So maybe we don't even want forests to be around.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And see, you're already an expert. You should apply for with the Swedish military. You'd get a good wage, and you would work 3 days a year. Just saying. I mean, you should definitely take it into consideration. In all seriousness, what the hell is this? I mean, there is another problem. The Swedish military lacks its opportunity to actually be tested in the field. I mean, Sweden is not in NATO, and Swedish infantry, for instance, hasn't been in a field operation for more than 2 decades. I mean, it's not like with the Norwegian military or even the German military or even most of Europe's military, which at the very least has had to be tested in an actual theater of war due to various missions in which NATO has been engaged in the last 25 to 30 years. That was not the case with Sweden. The Swedish military, the only test that they had in the field was to extinguish the forest fires in their own country, and they failed miserably at that. So I guess this is the result of being so pampered and privileged for so long that you lose sight of reality. And with that said, what kind of a mind is it required for someone to think that, oh my God, a military man digs up a well to help the civilian population in a combat zone, and then to come up and criticize that move because, oh my God, it limits the movement of women because now they no longer have to walk 10 kilometers to fetch for water. They just have a well at the end of the village, at the edge of the village. I mean, what kind of a mind is it required to come up with such a critique?
Yeah, it's a really insane kind of critique. And it's not something that limits the movement of women. It actually frees women up because now they're no longer forced to, march for 10 kilometers, however long it is, to get water. Now they have more time to do with to actually decide what to do with that time, and it's not like these women are locked up in their homes when they're not gathering water.
Yeah, of course not. And the thing is that such a situation did occur now, except for the feminist criticism, in Uganda, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I don't know if you remember the articles a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, when there was the situation that it was simply safer to send women to fetch for water because worst case scenario, women would be raped, but they would still get to be alive. Whereas if men would go to fetch water, they would definitely be killed by all sorts of insurgent groups that were in the forests between the civilian villages and the actual water source. And when foreign militaries started intervening in these areas, and they started attempting to secure the integrity of the civilian populations, that's the first thing they did. They dug up wells and tried to make it as little necessary as possible for the civilians to need to venture within basically what was enemy territory until it was cleansed by various international coalitions that made the situation better eventually. And yes, foreign interventions sometimes make things better. Hear that, leftists? Anyway, so the first thing they did was indeed to bring in water closer somehow, either by digging up wells or whatnot. How would I would just want to see this guy go there and to tell the women in there that, oh my God, your freedom of movement has been limited because the Chinese soldiers or the Italian soldiers have built wells within your village. So now you no longer have to go for 10, 15 kilometers and risk being raped, but at least you had freedom of movement back then. Now you are not getting raped anymore, but you also don't have freedom of movement because potato. I mean, I would like to, in these cases, I would just put these ideologues straight into the battlefield, into the actual combat situation, and just go to the victims of it and just go ahead and tell them how they're being victimized by the fact that someone else comes in and builds them infrastructure.
Oh my God, your right to be raped has been abridged. Call the feminist police.
Yeah, it is amazing. It is amazing. And with this whole universal conscription business, I presume that in the next few years we're going to read a lot of comedy from the Swedish military. I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think I'm wrong. I think we'll be reading quite a lot of comedy like this from the Swedish military because I still think this is in the silly place quarter. I mean, uh, believing that, Jesus Christ, I just can't take this seriously. I can't.
Yeah, it's also, I mean, why exactly does Sweden need conscription? I mean, they're one of the safest countries in the world. They've avoided to stay out of wars for 200 years. Why exactly do they need conscription? Whatever. We've covered
Yeah,
that
well,
topic abundantly last episode.
yeah, well, they had their neighbors with Russia, but nevertheless, well, in the territorial waters, not terrestrially, but nevertheless, one last thing. We still have 3 minutes, so I can say this. One last thing is, I don't know what makes this Jan Thörnqvist individual think that his idea of including "quote unquote" gender perspective into international slash transnational organizations. I don't know where does he think this will go, because Sweden sometimes participates in NATO missions, but not really participate. But anyway, in the bureaucratic sense, it sometimes does. Now, I'm looking forward for the commander of armed forces of the Polish military to be convinced by Sweden's gender perspective. I think that is going to be very, very, very funny to watch. And I chose the commander in chief of the Polish military in particular because that's the individual in question is a very, very old school type of guy, who is both is very concerned of avoiding war, but at the same time he has no problem in going very, very old school in warfare. That's why there are quite a few Polish soldiers who've been decorated during the latest incursions in, I think it was in Afghanistan. But nevertheless, I'm looking forward for someone to try to convince that guy that there is a need for gender perspective in warfare. Uh, I can already imagine the creative ways in which he'll curse once you hear such a preposterous proposition. And with that, that's all I had to say.
All right. Hope that we'll see you next week at the same time. And until then, take the red pill.
Yeah, I'll announce on Thursday or on Wednesday whether I can actually come next week or not. So with that, take the red pill. Goodbye, everyone.